Hey guys, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. And today we're going to be talking about the family, which is, of course, one of the institutions, according to functionalists, that are vital for the survival of society. Other people, conflict theorists, not necessarily feel the family is as central to survival of society, or at least think of the family in as many different options. There are many different styles of families, Sherry, this is true. And we'll be talking about how the family relates to social institutions, other institutions, and other requirements. So just really quickly, I mean, there's been a lot of debate over quote unquote family values in the United States and to a certain extent in Europe as well. Politicians like to talk about the family because it makes them seem like they are espousing common values or core values of society. What could be more important than motherhood and apple pie, as it were? 30, 40 years ago, the main thing debate was about feminism, about whether women should have equal rights. And it may seem strange, but many people argued that women should not have equal rights because this helped destroy the family. So if women were able to go out and work, and if they earned the same the men earned, that they would then run off and they wouldn't become mothers, they wouldn't give birth to children, they wouldn't feed families. And so the argument was you needed this kind of this family image that you see here, for example, from the 1950s. This show, this was called The Honeymooners, where the husband is a bus driver and the wife basically sits at home, cooks and cleans. The husband comes home and yells at her and threatens to hit her and on a regular basis. This was comedy in the 1950s, as it were. So today, women still don't have equal rights, but they certainly have more rights than they had in the 1950s, where as a woman you couldn't open a bank account, you very often couldn't even get a job without signed permission from your father and or your husband. Now the debate is taking place over homosexuality and whether homosexuals should have the right to live like a marriage, like a legally recognized family. Again, with usually religious conservatives claiming this is destroying the moral fabric of America, or this conflicts with what the family is supposed to do. The family is supposed to be a place where you raise children, or you have children, first of all, right? On the other hand, again, homosexuals are simply saying they want to have the same right heterosexuals have had, which is the right to share a legal household with the one they love. So what do these changes mean for family as an institution? Certainly things have changed in the last 50, 60 years. So let's have a look at that. But first we have to go through quite a bit of names and terms. I'm going to try to go through them fairly quickly. You can feel free to go back and repeat anything you didn't quite understand. Did you know under Roman law, and I emphasize this point because under Roman law, family meant the household. It didn't mean necessarily just a relationship between parents and children. It certainly was not something that was idealized in any sense. Family was business, and you married for business, you had children for business, and everything was about business. In fact, the status of wives and children, their legal status was the same as that of a slave. In fact, children could be sold into slavery because they were considered the property of the paterfamilias, the father. And if the father killed a child, generally there was nothing that could be done about it. There was no society could not intervene because this was something happening within the sacred status of the family. So families were not necessarily a pleasant place. And in fact, up until about 100 years ago, this was still the dominant conception of society, of the family. The family was a place where you worked. So what family means clearly is a social distinction, is something defined by society. So basic concepts. Okay, family. A group of people living together, sharing a common household. Typically, this would involve the rearing of children, with the understanding that those children would then become workers within that household. Kinship, well, a broader bond. Typically, you're including uncles, aunts, and their cousins. So these kin can be very important with the family because kin would be the first natural allies of a family group. Marriage, a legally recognized or at least socially recognized relationship, usually involving economic cooperation, the establishment of a household, usually involving childbearing, and therefore regulation of sexual activity. Families of affinity, well, this means other groups that think of themselves as a family, but they don't maybe fit the dominant social status of a family. We have, of course, extended family. Throughout most of human history, families were not just parents and children. That's what we call today the nuclear family, which is seen as an ideal. The extended family meant that you would include other kin, uncles, aunts, grandparents, grandchildren, and these families might live in the same household to help share goods and services. Marriage patterns. Endogamy meant you marry people of the same social category. In some societies, this is required. So you're required to marry people of your same social status, maybe people of your caste or race, maybe people of your income group. Now, if it's not a requirement, there might be a lot of social pressure to do these things, or simply it's the easier. These are the people you know, the people who go to the same clubs, the same places, are the people you're going to meet and be likely to marry. Exogamy means the opposite tendency. You deliberately try to marry outside the immediate group, and this happens typically in societies in rural areas where if you just married within the local group, you would have a lot of inbreeding and people with maybe extra limbs or whatever. So instead, the society has specific requirements that you have to go outside the immediate vicinity to get married. Monogamy, of course, marriage where you marry one other person. Mono, one, gamy, marriage. Polygamy, you marry poly, many other people. And that could be either polygyny, which means marrying many wives. So this is a pattern in many countries around the world. Mormons in the United States used to believe that this was correct, and many Mormons still believe this is correct. So they believe they are supposed to marry with many wives and have as many children as possible, because of their interpretation generally of the Old Testament, where in fact in the Old Testament many of the patriarchs did have many wives. David had up to 300, I believe, King David, that is. It was normal, of course, for kings to have many wives because they needed, the marriage was like a trade agreement, so you needed to have lots of wives and children that you could marry off. Again, remember, it was a business. Polyandry, that's when one woman marries two or more men, is relatively rare, but does happen typically in places where land is very scarce. So men, rather than fighting over a woman in a piece of land, would agree to basically share. Usually the men involved are brothers, so the brothers would have the same wife, and they would I guess not necessarily care that much whose kid is whose. Who knows? That's their issue. Power in the family. Typically, patriarchy is the normal pattern around the world, particularly in agrarian and industrial societies. Patriarchy is a system where the male father figure controls the property, and at least in theory, controls and owns the product of the family members. Now, whether or not, obviously in every patriarchal society, there are different levels, and women have different levels of rights and responsibilities. Matriarchy would be a society where women control the property and family members. Now, matriarchy you see sometimes in tribes or groups, societies which are at the horticultural stage. This is where women do the farming and grow most of the food. So therefore they have that power. On the other hand, societies where they become militaristic, or agrarian societies where you need a large amount of land and working the large amount of land with animals, this tends to favor male domination. So men tend to control the resources in those types of societies. Now, in practice, what happens within the household may or may not go along with the dominant norms. You may have a household where, as a man or a woman, you share power with your husband or wife. But if the dominant family pattern is patriarchal, that's always going to give the male in the family more power. And Europe historically has been extremely patriarchal. Men in most of Europe inherited everything, including the wife's fortune. One reason Queen Elizabeth I never married was the fear that if she married a king from another country, or a prince from another country, that prince would then become King of England. So Queen Elizabeth I of England never married. She was the Virgin Queen, and she said very clearly, I'm not going to get married because I do not want to give my throne, my crown, to another man. I want to be the king, or rather the queen, right? So the very notion of a queen ruling was like boggled the mind, but they handled it. On the other hand, when Queen Victoria did marry, he married an Austrian prince, a Germanic prince, Prince Albert. When she married, Parliament made it very clear in the marriage contract that he was a prince regent. He would never be king. She would maintain the throne, and he would be simply her husband. So if you ever watch a wonderful movie about Victoria, there's a scene where she orders him around, and he says, I'm your husband, I'm not your subject. You can't order me around. Anyway, now to compare that with Islam, which we often think of as a very patriarchal religion, and it is, but yet when Islam was established, it established very specific rights for women. So for example, women inherited 1/3 of the estate. So if you had a daughter and a brother, the daughter would have to get at least 1/3, or 1/3. The son would get 2/3. So it wasn't equal, but at least gave her something. Also, within Islam, the woman keeps her property in marriage. So even when she gets married, she can still have her own property, and she can manage her own property. The difficulty, of course, is the social space in Islamic societies tend to be very male-dominated. Women are supposed to be secluded, so it is, of course, very difficult for women to run or manage a business. Not that they don't do it. And even so, there have been women rulers in the Islamic world. So this is not, again, not something that is entirely unheard of. Descent. So descent is where you trace your lineage, and it's also where you get your inheritance. But they may not always be the same thing. So sometimes, again, these are social tendencies. Most societies tend to trace lineage through the male side of the family, but there are exceptions. So for example, Jews trace their lineage through the mother's side of the family. So as a Jew, you would say, I'm Jewish because my mother was Jewish. Right? Most other religions trace their nationality and religion through the father's side. Property may, again, go either way. So Jews may inherit their Jewish status from the mother, but they inherit their property from their father. And even when there is matrilineal descent of property, it usually doesn't go from a woman to a woman. It goes from the uncle to cousin, male uncle to the male cousin on the sister's side. So it doesn't always mean that women are in control just because there's matrilineal descent. Other things, patrilocality. Do you live near the husband's family? In which case, of course, the husband will have more resources because his family's there. Matrilocality means you live through the mother's family. This would be more true in places where you inherit through the mother's side. So therefore you want to be where the property is, right? And neolocality. In modern society, children tend, when they get married, tend to set up a separate household. But keep in mind, that's largely because of we have the economic ability to do so. And that may not always be true. In the past, people stayed with one of the other parent, primarily for economic reasons. You simply did not have enough money when you got married to set up a household, unless you waited until your parents died. Right? And then you might be 40, 50, 60 years old. This is one reason why historically men did get married a lot later than women, because men were the ones who would inherit. So therefore, they very often literally did have to wait until they would inherit, or the parents would give them enough money to get married. On the other hand, women, they could get married as soon as they became of age, which sometimes meant you'd have 40-year-old men marrying 15-year-old women. Okay, so we're going to leave it right there, and the next lecture is obviously going to continue on the same theme. So, see you in the next lecture. In the meantime, make sure you check the companion. There's an article to read about matrilineal families, and have fun. Bye.